They didn't die from hunger. They didn't die from disease. They didn't even die from violence. They died inside paradise. In 1968, scientists created a world where survival was almost guaranteed. There was unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no harsh weather, no competition for resources. On paper, it was the perfect environment. At first, everything worked exactly as expected. The population grew rapidly. Healthy mice raised healthy young. The colony expanded faster than anyone had predicted. It looked like proof that removing hardship create the perfect society. Then something changed. Not the food, not the environment, not the experiment itself. Mice changed. Mothers began abandoning their nests. Young adults stopped interacting with one another. Some animals withdrew from the rest of the colony completely. Others repeated the same behaviors over and over, as if the instincts that had guided every previous generation were slowly fading. The colony was still full. Food was everywhere. Water was everywhere. Nothing was missing except something no scientist had expected to disappear: will to behave like a society. What happened inside that small laboratory shocked the researchers, who watched it unfold. And more than half a century later, people are still arguing about what it really means. Because this wasn't just the story of an experiment. It became one of the most debated studies ever conducted on social behavior. How could a population with everything it needed still collapse? Let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened, we have to start with the man behind the experiment. In the 1960s, American ethologist John B. Calhoun had spent years studying how animals behaved as their populations grew. Again and again, he noticed the same pattern. When density increased, behavior began to change in unexpected ways. Not because food was running out, not because disease was spreading, because social relationships became increasingly difficult to maintain. Calhoun wanted to know one thing: was there a limit to how much social complexity a population could have? So he designed what many people would later call the perfect mouth. Every detail was carefully controlled. Fresh food was always available. Clean water never ran out. The temperature remained comfortable. Predators didn't exist. Disease was tightly controlled. Every physical need was met. If survival depended only on resources, this colony should have flourished. At first, it looked like it would. The first mice explored every corner of their new home. They built nests, raised healthy litters, protected their territory. The population doubled, then doubled again. Everything seemed to confirm Calhoun's idea that removing external dangers would allow society to thrive. But hidden beneath that success, another process had already begun. It couldn't be seen on a population chart. It didn't appear in the food supply, and it wasn't written in the daily reports. It appeared in something far more fragile: the way the mice treated each other. Small changes, almost impossible to notice at first. A delayed response, an ignored interaction, a nest left unattended for just a little too long. Individually, none of these moments looked important. Together, they became the first signs that something inside the colony was beginning to break. And once those changes started, they never stopped. At first, no one realized anything was wrong. The colony was still growing. Food supplies were untouched. Water was unlimited. The shelters were clean. If you had walked into the laboratory, you probably would have called the experiment a success. But the researchers weren't just counting mice. They were watching behavior. And behavior was beginning to tell a very different story. The first signs were almost invisible. Some mothers became less attentive to their newborns. Not all of them. Just enough for the researchers to notice something unusual. A few young mice stopped exploring. Instead of competing for territory, they wandered alone or stayed hidden for long periods. Then another pattern appeared. Some dominant males became unusually aggressive, while others seemed to give up entirely. The social order that had once organized the colony was becoming unstable, not because the animals lacked food, but because they no longer seemed to know where they belonged. That was the first clue. The problem wasn't survival, it was society itself. The changes spread slowly, then suddenly, they were everywhere. More nests were abandoned. More young mice grew up without normal social interactions. Animals that should have learned how to compete, protect territory, and raise offspring never developed those behaviors at all. Each new generation inherited a colony that was becoming less socially functional than the one before it. The population was still increasing, but underneath those numbers, something essential was disappearing. Researchers had expected overcrowding to create more conflict. Instead, they were watching the gradual collapse of normal social behavior. And then, a completely new type of mouse began to appear. Animals that looked perfectly healthy, perfectly clean, completely safe, yet they seemed to have lost interest in almost everything that had once defined life inside the colony. The researchers would eventually give them a name: the beautiful ones. But what made them so different? And why did they become one of the most remembered parts of the entire experiment? That's where the story takes an even stranger turn. When Calhoun described this new group, he wasn't talking about stronger mice or smarter mice. He was describing animals that had simply withdrawn. They rarely fought, they rarely competed, they showed little interest in mating. Instead, they spent most of their time eating, sleeping, and grooming themselves. Their fur was almost flawless, their bodies carried few scars. Compared to the rest of the colony, they looked perfect. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. At first glance, they seemed like the healthiest mice in the experiment. But appearances can be deceptive. A perfectly clean animal wasn't necessarily a healthy member of society. The researchers noticed something unsettling. These mice weren't building nests. They weren't raising young. They weren't defending territory. And they weren't replacing the social roles that older generations had once filled. One generation after another, the colony became less experienced, less connected, less capable of passing on normal social behavior. The decline wasn't explosive. It was quiet. Each generation inherited a world where fewer social behaviors were being learned, until many of those behaviors disappeared almost entirely. Birth rates continued to fall, more nests were abandoned, more young mice grew up without normal interactions. Eventually, even when space became available again, the colony never returned to the way it had been before. That observation fascinated researchers. If overcrowding had been the only problem, why didn't the population recover once pressure was reduced? Calhoun believed that something deeper had happened. Not a failure of food, not a failure of shelter, but a failure of social organization itself. It was an idea that sparked decades of debate. Some researchers agreed. Others argued that the experiment reflected the unique conditions of captivity rather than a universal rule about society. And that debate is still continuing today. For decades, Universe 25 has been used as a warning. Some people claim it predicted the future of human society. Others argue it proved that comfort inevitably leads to collapse. But the truth is more complicated. Scientists have never reached a single conclusion about what really happened inside that enclosure. One explanation focuses on population density. Even though there was enough food and space, the constant presence of other mice may have created overwhelming social pressure. Another theory points to the breakdown of learned behavior. Young mice didn't simply inherit genes. They inherited a society. And when parents stopped teaching normal behaviors, each new generation had fewer social skills. And alas, researchers believe the artificial environment itself played a major role. After all, this wasn't nature. The mice couldn't leave. They couldn't create new territories beyond the walls. Every social interaction happened inside a closed system. Others argue that the experiment has often been oversimplified. Calhoun never claimed that human civilization was destined to repeat the same fate. He studied mice, not people. Human societies are shaped by culture, technology, education, cooperation, and the ability to consciously change our behavior. Those differences matter a lot. And yet, Universe 25 continues to capture people's imagination, not because it predicts our future, but because it asks uncomfortable questions. What happens when social structures begin to weaken? How important are purpose, community, and meaningful roles in a society? Can material comfort alone create a healthy civilization? Or does survival require something more than simply meeting physical needs? More than 50 years later, researchers are still debating those questions. And perhaps that's why Universe 25 refuses to disappear from public conversation. The experiment ended decades ago. The discussion never did. When the experiment finally came to an end, the enclosure was still full of food. Fresh water still flowed. The shelters were still standing. The environment hadn't failed, but the colony never recovered. Years later, the laboratory was dismantled, the cages were emptied, the notes were archived, the experiment was over. But one question remained. What exactly had collapsed? Was it overcrowding? Was it stress? Was it the loss of social roles? Or was it something no experiment could fully measure? More than half a century later, scientists still don't agree. And maybe that's the most important part of this story. Universe 25 wasn't a prophecy. It wasn't proof that human civilization is doomed.